Right, thanks. You can hear me okay? All right, just to be clear, so the Institute for the Study of Learning Expertise is not part of Georgia Institute of Technology. I still do run that on a part-time basis. I spend most of my time at Georgia Tech Research Institute. I want to thank all of my many collaborators over the decades who have contributed to a lot of the ideas I'll talk about today. There's lots of human endeavors that involve the accumulation of expertise and knowledge, but science is different. Science encodes that knowledge as formal laws or models or theories of the phenomena it observes. I'm talking about things like Kepler's laws of planetary motion, or Newton's theory of gravitation, or Dalton's atomic theory, or Krebs' citric acid cycle. We often refer to the process of finding these laws or models or theories as scientific discovery. So, given the current excitement about AI, it's natural to ask whether AI might assist scientific discovery by, say, automating key steps in the research process, or finding insights that might otherwise be missed, or producing more complete, integrated accounts of complex phenomena, which might lead to accelerating the generation of new results and generating, say, trustworthy laws and models. This talk, I'm going to review the history of AI work on scientific discovery and consider some remaining challenges. I am not, even though this is a session on accelerating discovery, I'm not going to talk much about that. I'll discuss it a bit at the end. I will focus primarily on the development of integrated accounts of discovery that touch on many different aspects of science. I want to make a few observations. First, though, if you look at the history of science, you'll see some important lessons. Researchers typically adopt some explicit formalisms for laws or models that they use to communicate with others. If you read their papers, you'll find them. Right? You'll find diagrams, you'll find causal links, you'll find equations, you'll find reaction pathways, different things in different fields, but every branch of science has explicit formalisms that are used for communication. Second, research is not entirely data-driven. We hear a lot about data and the role of data in science. That's not the whole thing, right? Scientists use existing knowledge to aid the discovery process, to constrain it. And as a result, it doesn't just stop with that. Science is a closed loop where you collect data to generate hypotheses and revise your models, but then that suggests more data you might collect. You revise your models, you collect more data, and you keep going in a closed loop. Also, science is not just about building predictive models. Right? Mature fields insist that their observations be explained in terms of unobserved entities or processes. We don't hear a lot about that in the data-centric views these days. And finally, scientific insights do not require large amounts of data. Historically, people have worked with small to moderate samples, and there are computational techniques that work with those too. So we should keep all of this in mind when we talk about computational approaches to scientific discovery. So now let me tell you some history about research in this area, starting with the philosophy of science. This is actually how I got into this. When I was an undergraduate, I took a philosophy of science course, and we read Popper and some other philosophers who said things like this that I found surprising. He said, and Karl Popper is a major philosopher of science, had massive influence. He said, the initial stage of conceiving or inventing a theory seems neither to call for logical analysis nor to be susceptible to it. My view is that every discovery contains an irrational element or a creative intuition. And some of his descendants, like Carl Hempel, who is also very influential, believe the same thing. Discovery was inherently irrational, beyond understanding. Basically, they were neo-vitalists, right? They thought there was something magical or mystical about the human mind, and that humans could be creative and machines could not. What changed is in the late 50s, two fields cognitive psychology and artificial intelligence, which was a newly coined term then, suggested that maybe that wasn't the case. And in particular, one of the co-founders of artificial intelligence and an early champion of computational models of human cognition, Herb Simon, wrote a book chapter in 1966, where he argued that scientific discovery isn't really that mysterious. It's a variety of problem solving. When he said problem solving, he was talking about search through a space of possibilities, like searching through a maze. You search that space by applying mental operators to generate new states, and you guide that search by heuristics that make it tractable. You may know the trick in a maze, right? If you always put one hand, put your hand on one side, you'll eventually get out, unless it's a trick maze. So that's an example of a heuristic you can use to make what appears to be an intractable search much more tractable. Now, heuristic search had already been implicated by the late 50s in studies of human cognition, from proving theorems to playing chess. And that framework suggested not only a way that we might understand scientific discovery in humans, but also suggested ways that we might automate it. So how can we state that task more precisely? This is still pretty generic, intentionally so. You can always define any computational problem in terms of inputs and outputs, right? So you're given scientific data or phenomena that you want to describe or explain. You're given some knowledge and heuristics about the domain, right? So this is never completely knowledge-free. And you're given a space of candidate laws or hypotheses or models that you might want to consider. That does not have to be stated explicitly. It could be stated in terms of some initial state and some way of generating new states. But you have this space, and now you want to search that space. You want to find laws or models that describe or explain the observations. That's the task, right? It takes different forms in different fields, but it always is something like this. And again, it's not really a simple thing like this. It's a closed loop where you collect more data and so on. But Simon suggested that we can address this task using heuristic search through the space of candidates. And over the past 50 years, that insight has been very productive and has led to many successful AI discovery systems. You won't have heard about them because they don't involve deep learning. But they're there, and I'll tell you about some of them today. There's been a community of people who work in this area for a long time. I mean, I did my dissertation on the topic in the late 70s, but I think the first symposium Jeff Schrager and I ran at Stanford in 1989. And then there were later meetings in 95 and 98 through until recently in March of 2023, we had a AAAI Spring Symposium on the topic. We had another one on integrated discovery last fall in Arlington. And there's been other events too, some of which I organized, some of which I just attended. But it's been an active area, not a large group of people, but people who have a long-term commitment to trying to understand the discovery process from a computational perspective. It's also led to books on the topic. That one on the left grew out of my thesis. It was a bit later, but there's been many others, some of them edited. And there's a new one coming out based on the symposium we ran in 2023. Should be hitting the streets any day now once I send my chapter in. So anyway, but they really demonstrate, if you look in the contents of these books, you'll see incredible diversity. I would say a lot more diversity of problems and methods than you would find at, say, ICML or NeurIPS these days. I also want to make a clear distinction between scientific discovery and data mining. There are some similarities. They both use computational methods to search a space of laws or models. But data mining generally focuses on commercial applications. Scientific discovery, of course, focuses on scientific disciplines. Data mining almost emphasizes, is proud of, that it deals with large, giant data sets. When that field was launched in the mid-90s, it was like maybe only a few million. Now it's trillions. But the point is that they always played up the big data aspect. Scientific discovery, generally, a lot of it at least, deals with small to moderate sized data sets. Not by preference. We'd be happy to have more data, There are some fields of science, like astronomy, that are really drowning in data. Many are not. And that means you need to turn to methods that have what's called low sample complexity. And finally, and this is really important to me, data mining researchers almost always use notations invented by computer scientists or other computational fields, things like decision trees or Bayes nets or neural nets. Work on scientific discovery, as I define it, attempts to acquire knowledge stated in terms of established scientific formalisms, things that the scientists themselves use to communicate. And I think that's really, really important. Now, it's clear that data mining methods can be applied to scientific data, and it has been used that way very productively sometimes, but I would not count the output as scientific knowledge. It's not the kind of thing you would publish in a scientific paper and say, here's a model of some chemical reactions, right? Or here's a model of gene regulation. That's not the same as scientific data mining. Okay, so the main points of this talk. 3 main messages. The discovery of scientific knowledge is a complicated and multifaceted activity. It's not one thing. Even within a single field, it's not one thing. Second, this is not a new field. It's been around since the 70s, producing good results. And AI researchers have made a lot of progress on automating the individual facets of discovery in many different disciplines. But there's been remarkably little work on how to put the pieces together, on how to build integrated discovery systems. So in order to tell you more about that, I'm going to have a fair amount of review about the work that's been done, and also pose some challenges toward the end. And just to give you an example of the kind of thing I'm talking about, let's look at the history of chemistry. What you find is before modern chemistry, the chemists, or maybe they were called alchemists back then, started to build taxonomies of different substances based on their taste and their color and their texture and things like that, right? Once they had those, then they could start to describe chemical reactions. But those were qualitative. They said, well, this and this combines to form this and this. Right? Only after they had the qualitative laws of that type were they able to start describing them quantitatively. It didn't make sense. They didn't have anything to describe quantitatively until you first had the qualitative structure. So you find the law of definite proportions, the law of combining volumes, and so on. After that, you find chemists starting to develop structural models of molecules, both inorganic and later organic. Organic structures were a lot more complicated. And then after that, you find models that have a deeper sort of explanatory story. Well, structural accounts are explanatory, but you also later find models of biochemical processes of cellular metabolism and things like that. So there's this natural progression that you find in most fields of science where later stages build on earlier ones, and we will come back to this, but when I go through the facets of discovery, you'll see I'll talk about each of these things in turn. Make sense so far? This may seem obvious to you. I mean, the tension is to give you sort of general principles, general ideas that seem to hold across different disciplines, and yet to honor the fact that different fields really do think about science in different ways. They have different notations, different conceptions of things. Okay, so I'm going to claim that we can partition scientific discovery, and this is not all of science. There are lots of other things, some of which I'll come back to at the end, like experimentation, which I don't consider part of discovery, but is certainly enabling of discovery and linked to it. So 5 major kinds of activity. The first is the formation of taxonomies, what some people call ontologies now, but historically were called taxonomies. Second is the finding of qualitative laws. Given those, you can find numeric laws and equations. And you can also later form structural models that try and explain what's going on in terms of what are the components of things, how are they made up, things you typically can't see, but you can posit and would explain certain regularities. And then you have the generation of process models, which talk about how things change over time. You can have both qualitative and quantitative versions of structural and process models. Again, typically you start off with qualitative versions and then you make them quantitative. Don't let anyone, especially someone with a background in physics, tell you that you must have a quantitative model in order to be scientific. That's nonsense. There are plenty of, the germ theory of disease was a massive breakthrough, and it was purely qualitative. So, doesn't mean quantitative models are bad. We should strive for them, but we shouldn't reject non-quantitative accounts. Okay, so again, a lot of this is going to be obvious to you because you've all read enough about the history of science to get it. So I won't go into great detail. The task of taxonomy formation is you're given a set of observed entities, like fossils from dinosaurs, or stars and their intensity and size and spectra, or rocks and what they look like, what their textures are, and how hard they are. Right? And you want to organize them. Could be a flat set, but it could also be a hierarchy, as in the dinosaur and rock examples. Since the 1960s, there's been work on what was originally called numerical taxonomy, invented by biologists using some early digital computers, and they would automatically generate taxonomies from based on the features of organisms. The first example within the machine learning literature that I know about was a system called AutoClass that Cheeseman and colleagues developed at NASA Ames. And I'll tell you about that in a minute because it's related to the astronomy talk we heard earlier today. More recently, there's been a lot of work in what's called computational phylogenetics in biology that constrains the process of taxonomy formation in terms of assumptions about how evolution occurs. So AutoClass built a probabilistic taxonomy. It was actually just 2 levels, but it could have been more. It represented its categories in terms of means and variances on attributes. It initially assigned entities to K classes at random, used a technique called expectation maximization, which was popular in the Bayesnet community, although this was before that, to update its class descriptions. And it would iteratively increase the number of categories until it could not get a better score. They applied this to some data from an infrared satellite on 5,400 stars. They had 94 wavelengths, and they grouped them into 77 distinct classes. And one thing that came out of that was a new class of black body stars that had excess infrared in some regions of the infrared spectrum. And that led to publications in the astronomy literature. And as far as I know, this is again, numerical taxonomy went back farther, and that led to many publications. But this was definitely within the AI and machine learning community. Now let's look at qualitative laws. Things like chemical reactions. I'm glad you can't see the notation here, because that actually suggests a structural model which people did not initially have. But for example, chemists found that sulfuric acid, which was a name they had for a substance, combines with calcium hydroxide to form calcium sulfate in water. Okay, and or in ecology, people might observe that certain animals prey on other animals, and then those prey on others, and so on. And these are qualitative relationships, right? Just between sort of discrete categories that are defined in your taxonomy, right? My colleagues and I built an early system called Glauber, which was reproduced some examples from the early history of chemistry on the reaction, how they might have found the reaction of acids and alkalis. But there were, after that, more applied projects with a system called RL that found qualitative laws for respiratory syndromes and carcinogenicity, a system called PROGAL that did a number of interesting things. Let me tell you a bit about that. So this is a system that was given data on chemical compounds, their components, what their structure was, and whether or not they were mutagenic. cause mutations. 230, not a big set, 230 nitrogen compounds, some mutagenic, some not. They use a system that is a technique called inductive logic programming that does heuristic search to a space of rules to try and cover some of the cases based on the descriptors of the training cases. And then it will repeat that on things that aren't covered, so it will find a set of rules. And one example of their system found a law that said a compound is mutagenic if it has an aliphatic carbon atom attached by a single carbon bond in a 6-member aromatic ring. Now, it didn't actually generate the text. Certainly we could do that these days, but they did have a graphical interface to show people what it looked like, and that led to publications in the biochemistry literature. There were, at the same time, people doing a lot of statistical approaches to this. Arguably, this gave a lot deeper insight into what's going on. I should also mention that although the vast majority of work on finding qualitative laws, qualitative relationships, the vast majority is driven by using induction and is actually closely related to some of the work in data mining. That's not the only way to go. You can also use knowledge. For example, knowledge that's in literature to propose promising candidates. And I just have to mention a really interesting system that Donald Swanson developed in 1988 called Aerosmith that went through Medline abstracts. Medline is a database of medical abstracts, and it's broken into different groups for different subfields. And it would find a causal link in one abstract, and then it would look around and find another abstract where, like, it found that A leads to B, and it would find another one that says A seems to lead to C. So, for example, it found that something called spreading depression in the brain leads to migraine headaches, and there was another abstract that said, well, magnesium can inhibit spreading depression. So maybe, the system concluded, magnesium might alleviate migraines. The system proposed that. That was a hypothesis. They tested it, and magnesium is now a treatment for migraine headaches. And it was found by Aerosmith. Okay. Now, it produced many other plausible connections. Some of them have led to adopted medical treatments. Now, this might sound a little bit to you like an early version of large language models, right? It is. I mean, and more recent work has used large language models to play the same kind of games as a paper that has just appeared on the web by Gottweiss et al. It's one of these papers from Google that has like 30 authors. Same kind of idea, although much more complicated. And I don't know if they need all their machinery, but the point is that this idea of literature-guided hypothesis formation is alive and well. Now let's turn to going from qualitative relations to numeric relations, because this has really got maybe the lion's share of attention in AI for discovery over the years. You're given a set of observed entities with numeric descriptors, and you want to find one or more equations that describe them, right? I mean things like the ideal gas law, right? The Kepler's laws of planetary motion, or Coulomb's law. And I did my thesis on this. I didn't build the first system that would induce numeric laws, but it was I probably did the most early work, and it was one that became most visible and has become very influential over the years. I called it Bacon. I'll tell you about it more in a minute. Another system that our collaborator developed, Jan Zitkoff, called Fahrenheit, that Bacon only did reconstructions of things from the history of science, both physics and chemistry. Fahrenheit, he actually applied it to electrochemistry and found some new relationships. There's a system called Lagrange that Saša Jurovský and Ljubčo Todorovský in Slovenia developed that they applied in a number of areas, but mostly ecological dynamics. And there's been a lot of work recently, a system called Eureka that came out in 2009, a system called Cindy that came out about 10 years ago. I'll mention more of these later, but let me just tell you briefly how Bacon worked, not because it's the state of the art, because it's not, okay? It's really simple and amazingly effective, and was a surprising result at the time. So it carried out search through a problem space, not of laws directly, but of sort of theoretical terms. For example, let's start with some primitive variables like the distance and period of a planet from its primary, of a moon from its planet from the sun. It had operators for combining new terms like taking ratios or products. It had heuristics. For example, if x over y were a constant, then you would expect that x would increase as y increases. Right? Is that right? Yeah. And so it would say, well, I see that x increases with y increases, maybe I should take the ratio. And it would repeat that process. But it also would find a law at one level of abstraction, and then it would apply it, the whole idea recursively, so that constants it found at this level became variables at the next level. So it could build a hierarchy. That's how it found like the ideal gas law. I named this after Sir Francis Bacon because he was a champion of data-driven discovery, and Bacon was very much that, although it certainly had some generic knowledge about what's going on. And it rediscovered a bunch of numeric laws from the history of physics and chemistry. And this, I just want to show you what they look like to assure you this is not simple multiple linear regression. Right? Bacon was finding a rich set of formula that were like things that appeared in the historical literature, including some laws that introduced new intrinsic properties, things like index of refraction, mass, which is not directly measurable, of course, it's inferred, and specific heat in the heat law. Bacon introduced this when it needed to move beyond the data, and I'll come back to that later because the introduction of new variables is one of the things that is, I think, understudied in work in this area. I also want to mention this system that Todorowsky and Jurovsky developed, Lagrange, in the Josef Stefan Institute in Slovenia. It was a system that was inspired by Bacon, but Bacon was about algebraic laws. They said, well, we can do this for differential equations. And so they took multivariate time series. They had a set of dependent variables they wanted to predict how they changed over time. And they gave it some generic knowledge, some knowledge about the kinds of equations they would consider, anticipated in terms of a context-free grammar. So that you could this is a generative model. And you would generate a possible parse tree that would give you an equation structure, and that would be something that they would consider. They applied this successfully to ecological, hydrological, and other dynamic data sets. And over the past 10 years, there's been a whole new body of work coming out of people with not much AI background in any classic sense of that. They come out of physics, applied math, mechanical engineering. They tend to be heavy on continuous math. Early AI work on discovery were people who came out of thinking about search through a space of discrete model structures. These people are thinking primarily about search through a parameter space. But they're working on the same problem, right? They are trying to find laws, numeric laws, often ODEs, sometimes PDEs, that are stated in established scientific formalisms. And so the meeting we had in March 2023 was bringing together the two communities and getting them to talk. And some of them were shocked that some of the older work went back to the 70s because they'd never heard of it. But it was a good meeting of minds. Okay, let's move on to going beyond description to more explanatory kinds of accounts. So in some cases, scientists have a set of observed entities and descriptions of them, and they want to find a structural model that explains things in terms of their components, and often those components are not observed. For example, maps are structural models, and now we can see the Earth from space, but in the early days, there was a lot of inference involved in creating that. You can see that map is not quite what we have now, but the shape's roughly right. I'm sure you've all heard about Kekulé's discovery of the benzene molecule, because that was an insight moment. But he had to infer those links. Those were not observed. And of course, we still don't know what's really inside the Earth, but we do have structural models based on inferences we make of what seismic measurements and so on. I did some early work on this. We built a system called Dalton that reproduced some of Dalton's early reasoning. But then others went on to get new results. Zitkoff and Fisher had a system called Gelman that came up with new models of elementary particles. And two systems in particular that should get your attention. One called Dendral, that I'll talk about in a second, which inferred organic chemical structures from mass spectroscopy data. And I'm sure you've heard about AlphaFold because it's got lots of attention. That's a system that infers protein structure from the protein strings, and it blew people away and is much better than anything that anyone had seen before. Dendral was. Let me just tell you about this briefly because it had a big effect on AI. Not just it actually had less effect on work on scientific discovery, I think, because it was beyond most of us. But it was a system. You gave it the component formula, for example, C6H5OH, and you'd give it a mass spectrum for that. As you take it to run it through a mass spec device, and it gives you a bunch of peaks and troughs. That is concentrations of various weights of fragments, molecular weights of fragments, and then it would reconstruct what was connected to what and what kind of links there were, and so on. Like Simon said, it relied on heuristic search through a space of possibilities. In this case, a space of structural models, but it also had a lot of domain knowledge about chemistry that used to constrain that search, and it produced many new results that were published in the refereed chemistry literature. Okay, so it was contributing to science. This was back in the 1970s on computers from the 1970s. So you do not necessarily need big server farms or massive amounts of data. Notice this isn't doing induction. Okay, I mean there's some data in the sense that you've got the mass spectral information, but no, this is an abduction problem. This is trying to generate plausible hypotheses that are consistent with a few observations. And a lot of science is like that, and that it deserves our attention just as much as the more data-driven stuff. I also just want to say that Dendral, that didn't stop there. They also had an extension to it called MetaDendral that actually induced the rules for what happens during mass spectral analysis, where a molecule is broken up into fragments. And so their system did induce, in that case, rules to talk about what the fragments would be, and then that got used as input to Dendral. Now, I just want to make a mapping. This is very, very similar to what happened with AlphaFold. AlphaFold has two stages, right? It's got a model of what goes on in protein folding, and it uses that to make predictions. But that model is learned from data. And Dendral had the same kind of thing, but in a very different framework, in a sort of classic symbolic AI framework. But they were playing very much the same game. And at the time, Dendral was just as revolutionary as AlphaFold. In fact, the whole expert systems movement was greatly influenced by the success of Dendral. And if you don't know what expert systems is, well, go read your history. It was the first major application and very successful application of AI technology back in the 70s and 80s, which led directly to the founding of machine learning as a research field, because we were trying to automate the construction of expert systems. Okay, the fifth stage, generating process models. You're given entities, just typically described at different points in time. You want to come up with a set of interacting processes. Again, these are typically not going to be observed. You have to infer them, that explain the behavior. Things like plate tectonics, which is a very slow process, but still a process, right? Or a little bit faster, the metabolic pathways, like the urea cycle, or the evolution of stars, or galaxies. I don't know if our speaker's still here, but all of those would be process accounts. Those could be qualitative, they could be quantitative. You probably want to start with qualitative and then move on. Examples, MeChem, I'll tell you about in a second. ACE, a system for postulating the evolution of geological landforms as processes like flooding and lava flows and earthquakes. ALP, which inferred predation networks among invertebrate and a system called IPM that we use for modeling aquatic ecosystems. But let me tell you about MeChem. It's another very impressive system that Raul Valdez Perez developed for his thesis at CMU. He, like me, he worked with Herb Simon. He was inspired by Simon's vision for computational discovery. The system is given the inputs and outputs to some reaction, but there may be many steps. These are physical chemicals reactions. Many steps along the way, and the chemists did not know what they were. They could come up with some plausible hypotheses, but they wanted to automate this and maybe find better ones. So it used a kind of constrained exhaustive search using domain knowledge to knock out many possibilities, to generate candidate expressions. It was interactive in the sense that users could turn constraints on or off, depending on what they cared about. And it found numerous pathways that led to articles in the chemistry literature. Again, these were published in the early 90s. So there have been many successes like this over the years. They just haven't gotten the same attention in the media that some of the later stuff has. The work that I did with Bridewell and others we call it inductive process modeling. This is where we're building quantitative process models. You're given multivariate time series data. You're given some knowledge about kinds of processes that might occur. For example, in ecology, there might be a growth process or a predation process or a nutrient absorption process. And you have some variables you want to predict. And then there's a system that searches through a space of process models. Each generic process has some equation fragments and some ranges on parameters. And then for each model structure, you try and fit the parameters to the data. And when you're done, you have a set of differential equations that you can simulate, but those are organized into higher level processes. In the same sense that in chemistry, you could state a reaction pathway as a set of differential equations, but chemists typically don't. They actually draw reaction pathways, and each reaction is a process. So it's a higher level organization that I think was very important in communicating in some disciplines. And I won't show you all our results with that system. A more recent version of it, this is synthetic data. We've tested it on a fair amount of real data too, but this was synthetic data to see how far we could go. This is from a predator-prey, 20-organism predator-prey food chain. And this is the multivariate, this is the time series. And the system is able to reconstruct the food chain based on this, and I couldn't do it. It looks really complicated to me. And I could tell you the details about how, but there's no time. So I just want to convince you that we've been making progress on many fronts over the years, and we understand the elements of scientific discovery, I think, much, much better than we did even 10 years ago. But then the question is, well, what else is there left to do? Well, one of the big things is putting the pieces together. Can we build integrated discovery systems that do all of these, that go from taxonomy formation to discovering of quantitative process models, and that hook up to other aspects of science, like, say, experimental design and data collection and so on? And the answer is, I think we can, but we need to work at it. There are 5 issues I think we have to address that I will go through one after another. There's been some, and I won't list them now. There's been some efforts on each one, but each deserves a lot more attention than it's received. First, discovery always occurs in some context, different forms in different fields, different settings. For example, if you're going to do law induction of some kind, qualitative or quantitative, you have to have a taxonomy. You have to know what your basic categories are to know that there's this kind of chemical and this is this kind of chemical and so on. Or if you're trying to build process models, you're going to build that out of law-like elements that you already have. So those have to come from somewhere. Isolated systems, if you look at the literature on computational discovery, these standalone systems depend on humans to provide that context. I would give, like in our stuff on process modeling, we give it generic processes, and it's not discovering those itself. or in work on finding numeric laws. I mean, you give it the basic categories. But there's another way out, and that is you could build cumulative systems that use the output from one module as input to the next. For example, you form taxonomies, and now that is given as input to a module for finding qualitative laws, and that then constrains search for quantitative laws and so forth. Right? I don't mean to say it should be a simple pipeline. I mean, there's going to be loops in here and so on. We know there are cases where taxonomies have been revised drastically, say with dinosaurs and birds, but that doesn't mean you can't take advantage of this. Back over, wow, that's a long time ago. When I was at University of California, Irvine, Bernd Nordhausen did this thesis with me on a system called IDS, an integrated discovery system, that and we didn't test it. This was all on historical examples, not anything new. But it would create a taxonomy from observed states of the world. For example, it would say, well, there are situations where HCl and NaOH, when they're in contact, their quantities decrease, but NaCl increases. That is because they're reacting, right? So it would discover these states and put them in a taxonomy. It would then hook them up and say, well, some states follow other states. For example, the HCl and NaOH continue to change, to go down until one of them is consumed, and then that stops. So that's like a qualitative law. But then it would attach numeric laws to the individual states and to relationships among the states. For example, it found that the final concentration of NaCl was a particular algebraic function of the initial concentrations of HCl and NaOH. Right? Law of combining weights. And each layer of description provided context for later ones. And the system found rediscovered laws about chemical reactions, Black's heat law, conservation of momentum, other things. So I think you get the idea. And I'm not saying this was the end all of writing. This was preliminary work that was never followed up. I'd love to see more work along these lines. Second, we need to, science isn't, you don't have the data and then you run it through your discovery system and then you're done. It doesn't work that way. Human science is an iterative process and things change. It's an online activity. New data come in, and sometimes you have to revise your laws and revise your models to take that into account. Now that's straightforward enough. There's been plenty of work in the machine learning literature going back to the certainly to the early 1990s on model revision. But if you have the kind of cumulative approach I just described, where later stages depend on earlier ones, then there's dependency issues you have to take into account. So what do you do there? Because the context can change. You had this context, and now the taxonomy's changed, so you have to now redo everything else. Do you have to redo everything? No. You can record dependencies. What laws, what models, what parts of the models are dependent on these earlier things, and you can say, oh, well, you only propagate the changes that are really needed. And that's very closely aligned with the notion of truth maintenance, an old idea in AI, goes back to Doyle, 1979. I think we could use that technology effectively to deal with this issue. Third, and this is getting a lot of attention these days, what some people call closed-loop discovery. These are AI systems that merge the design of experiments with the discovery process, and Mario told us about some work along those lines. I claim there are two pretty different types of closed loop of combination of experimentation and discovery. The first is knowledge lean. In fact, Bacon did something like this, where it would vary one variable at a time. It didn't know much about the domain, so it would say, well, let me vary this variable and change this and hold everything else constant. It would find a law. It would do it again. It would find a new law, and then it would go to a higher level, varying more things, and eventually it would be done. But Zitkoff-Fahrenheit did similar kinds of things in the area of electrochemistry, where he would find certain curves with peaks, and he would find laws connecting the peaks but he had a closed loop system that was actually it was connected to a real electrochemistry lab, so it was designing and running its own experiments. But there's also knowledge-rich closed loop discovery, and I'm thinking here of a system called Kekada that Kulkarni and Simon developed. This was a historical account of Krebs' discovery of the urea cycle, which is very rich and very interesting, with lots of sort of surprising, not nearly as methodical as you'd think, where he goes off on tangents and eventually finds great stuff. But also, more recently, work by Ross King and his colleagues on what he calls a robot scientist. This is in yeast metabolism and regulation of yeast metabolism, and they have built a pretty complex robot lab for doing this. Now, so there's this general notion of self-driving labs that I'm sure you've heard about. I'll say that is related, but it's really, most of that is not interested in finding interpretable models, things that I would really consider scientific discoveries. They're trying to sort of optimize the productivity of some chemical reaction, right, or something like that. It's related, but I'd say not as promising as this kind of work. So again, let me just say briefly about Zitkoff built the first robot scientist. Yep, that discovered these numerical laws and laws about the laws. It closed the loop. King has done similar stuff, but much richer, much more complicated models. These are qualitative models about yeast metabolism, and he's continuing to work on that. So and that's very impressive work. Another challenge is measuring and identifying new variables. And again, there's two types of work here. There's a type that is valuable, but I would say not very exciting, where you're actually you collect data, use supervised learning to create sort of virtual measuring devices. I'm thinking here about like the SkyCat project, where they collected images of stars and galaxies. They got humans to label about 5,000 of them, and then they built a decision tree that would classify future ones. And when they're done, they had a very useful tool that they could then use for distributional analyses. And more recent work by Nassim et al. This is in detecting nanovoids, and this is in material science. But again, it's good work, but they're not producing scientific models or variables that are scientifically interesting, or they're told what they are actually ahead of time. More interesting is things like the introduction of intrinsic properties that I mentioned, like specific heat or index of refraction, and some very recent work on what's called, this is where people combine equation discovery with the invention of new variables. They take a high-dimensional space, typically for spatial temporal data, and they compress it down into a low dimension, and then they find ODEs, or differential equations, for those. And so some people, this is associated with people. Often people use neural nets to do the compression, but then they use equation discovery to do the higher level stuff. This type is more rare, but I think it's definitely an interesting kind of integrated discovery. And then there's interacting with human scientists, right? I think this is really important. There have been some examples here and there, but I think the way to do that is to take your problem, do a task analysis of what the fragments are, and find out, think about which pieces are best done by human, which pieces are best done by the AI system. And it doesn't have to be things at this level. It could be modules, like the evaluation of a model rather than the generation of a model. And there's a system that we built for inductive process modeling that was interactive, and I won't go into the details, but really the human was driving at a high level, and they would call on the system to modify an existing quantitative process model based on data they gave it. I'll skip the thing on evaluation here. So then let me summarize. Scientific discovery does not involve any mystical or irrational elements. We can study it, we can even partially automate it. 40 years ago, that was a radical statement. People thought we were crazy. It's not crazy anymore. People now say, well, of course. It wasn't always that way. There are still people who think it's not possible, probably, but there's plenty of evidence it is. And the solution is you carry out heuristic search through a space of laws or models. It doesn't have to be searched to a discrete space. It can be searched to a parameter space if that's your favorite tool. But you have some kind of operations for generating new candidate structures or revising parameters. And the search is guided not just by data, but by knowledge about the domain. Could be hard constraints, could be soft constraints, but AI systems can discover hypotheses, laws, and models stated in formalisms and using concepts that are familiar to scientists. Yep. Computational scientific discovery is not a new field. It goes back to the 1970s. There was a lot of original resistance to this idea, but we showed them that it was possible. And one of the key insights that led to this was this insight that computers are not just number crunchers, right? They are general symbol processors that can encode anything you can write down, any scientific content, you can encode it on a computer, you can define a space, and you can search that space to try and find good models. Not all of these tasks involve induction from data. Some involve abduction and the construction of plausible models. And it's been contributed by people from many different fields, including philosophy, science, and psychology. A couple of myths I want to debunk, because I still see this kind of stuff, and it's nonsense. I hear people say, computing is changing the basic nature of scientific research. That's nonsense. I'm really almost done. Science has always been computational. Digital computers have not altered its basic operation. Maybe it speeds some steps up. It doesn't change the basic flow. Another is that traditional science stood on two legs, theory and observation, and computers give us two more legs, simulation and data analysis. And that's nonsense because scientists have always done simulation and they've always done data analysis. It's just, again, a question of speeding it up and making it maybe more accurate. And finally, that computer-aided science is best pursued with domain-specific tools. That there are cases where you want pretty specific tools, but there are some general principles of science and scientific discovery, and we can encode those as programming abstractions. And a lot of what I told you about with the components of science were like that. We need less rhetoric about how computers will change everything and more detailed work about it. So, but I have to do this because Beijing wanted me to talk about these issues. So we often hear about scaling to large data sets. That happens sometimes. We don't always have large data sets, but we do increasingly have to scale to more very complex models that involve interactions among many variables, for example, in gene regulation networks. So discovery tools may let us construct accounts of phenomena that are beyond the ability of unaided humans, at least in practical amounts of time. Also, we have to scale to very large spaces of scientific models that contain many, many candidates. For example, in ecology, lots and lots of possible models. Discovery tools may let us find accounts of phenomena that humans would overlook, so they might do a more complete search. We need less work, I say, on large data sets and more on complex models and large model spaces. And finally, since this is about accelerating science, I have to say, well, what else can we do with this? Clearly, if you can find more complex models in very large spaces, that could accelerate the discovery process. But I don't think you don't want acceleration by itself. Okay, you don't want to just find rapid models. You want to make sure the models are actually trustworthy. And I think three keys to that, and they underlie a lot of the work I described already, is that the models being discovered should be stated in established, understandable scientific formalisms, like reaction pathways, like differential equations, whatever your field wants, and that they make contact with available theories and domain constraints in the scientific domain. We don't ignore what's already known. And we want to move beyond description to deeper explanations, because those are important in many domains. And there's been, again, work on these. We have to keep them in focus. So, there's the summary. I'll stop. You can just read that. Thank you. And I did hear there's some references. I assume we can post this on the web. And I wanted to give credit to the people I consider the founders of this movement: Herb Simon, Jan Zitkoff, Josh Lederberg, and Edward Feigenbaum, who is still with us. Questions?
Thank you so much. We have about 12, 13 minutes for questions.
Where's my shills? Here's one.
Thank you for your talk. Can you point us to any examples of researchers or groups that have done a good job of beginning to integrate different facets of science together?
There aren't too many, for sure. I mean, again, there's some older work that I did and other people have done. I would say you would find cases where people have integrated two pieces, but certainly not the whole pipeline. There's certainly people in the large language model community who want to claim that they're trying to put all the pieces together. I don't know that very well. There was a paper that came out recently that sounds like it's a big integrated effort, but it wasn't integrating things like this. It was integrating different modules as people in the neural net community often do, but not with much contact. I mean, this is one where they were using literature and other sources to generate hypotheses, but it wasn't. So the answer is not as much as I'd like to see, and not much at all. Please point me if you know otherwise. Please let me know. Next.
What's the best way to get started if we think we have an application that might profit from this approach?
Well, which approach? Because I described many approaches. Give me an example of what you have in mind, and I'll hum a few bars, and I'll see if I can sing along.
I'm a fish biologist from Michigan here.
Sure.
We sample fish in a variety of lakes.
Yep.
We know there are patterns underlying the distribution of different species in different lakes. I'm thinking that some kind of a search like this might help us.
Well, there is quite a bit of work on distributional analysis in ecology. I'm not an expert in that area because because let's see. I'm trying to think about who's done work on that. I know Tom Dietrich at Oregon State University has done a fair amount of stuff on distributional studies of species, but I can't think of any others right now. That is easily mapped into a sort of classic you've got data and you're trying to describe it, say, as a mixture model, right? Mixture models were popular in the probabilistic AI community for many years, and there are mappings to some work in neural nets. But basically, imagine a set of Gaussian distributions, right? And you're trying to estimate them from the data. And there's various ways to do that using things like expectation maximization. So certainly I can point you to a couple of papers that do that, but more important is to get hooked into the sub-community of people who do this. There's an NSF-funded center at Cornell on AI for sustainability, and some, but not all of their work is in things like this. So Carla Gomez headed that up for many years. I assume it's still running. If you send me email, can send you a couple of pointers.
Thank you.
Okay, sure. But I hope you won't stop with the distributional analysis. I hope you'll actually go on to use that to build ecological models of what's going on and who's eating what and how they're affected by pollution and things like that. Yes, I can't see him. Uh-oh.
One of the things that I've always considered to be sort of central to the most interesting kinds of learning is coming up with new ontologies, new levels of abstraction that take you away from the current existing things, with not denying it or rejecting it, but developing a new way of describing it. So one example is if you're looking at time series, in many cases you can devise a concept of energy, and thinking about energy makes a much more concise, clear way of expressing how those time series are going to behave. You've touched on that in some of the examples that you described, but I was wondering if you could put a little more depth into that.
I did, but to be honest, I didn't spend much time on taxonomy formation or revision because most people think of it as so mundane. It's fun. It's clearly fundamental. but it's also probably the closest thing to classic data mining, right, where you do clustering or something like that, and that's almost always very data driven. When I'm talking about the work that I know about, it doesn't have to be, I don't think, and so I think there is potential there. And do you have any ideas about how to other mechanisms we could use to propose a new taxonomic organization?
Yeah, I don't think about this in terms of taxonomic organization. I think of it in terms of finding a novel taxonomy.
Yes.
Not a novel taxonomy, a novel ontology for
Well, maybe you should
objects and relations. But
clarify
we
the
should probably take this offline.
Okay, but just clarify for people the difference between a taxonomy and an ontology.
An ontology, philosophers define ontology as what is there. That is, what are the objects and relations that our discourse is defined in terms
That's right.
of. And so just recently, I was just constructing on the fly an example for medicine. Many centuries ago, you look at signs and symptoms and you see what the patient is doing. Centuries later and centuries ago now, we discovered that there are tiny little creatures that might live inside us, and the reproduction of those creatures inside our body may have a whole lot to do with the signs and symptoms that you observe.
Right.
So when those were invisible, the signs and symptoms were relatively incomprehensible. Once they were a visible part of
and
the
that's a great example because it shows that things like the introduction of positing new elements in a structural model or in a process can actually have implications for what seems much earlier upstream, that is the formation of these taxonomies, which I usually think of as you have to do it first, but it can be informed by later stuff. So there are definitely feedback loops, and I think we should explore that more. I think you're right. I mean, certainly what happened with the hot-blooded dinosaur hypothesis, right, came out of a bunch of reasoning about biomechanics of these things and how they couldn't be what we thought they were. They couldn't be big, these sluggish kind of beasts. They had to be something else, and that suggests that they were more like birds, and that led to big changes. So yeah, it's something like that. I think we could do much richer stuff. I think I undersold. Taxonomy formation is an aspect of ontology creation, but I think it undersells it. Plenty of work to be done there. One more? You don't pay the audience enough.
It seems to me that you are talking a bit about David Deutsch's concepts beyond Karl Popper's with.
I'm sorry, say again?
It sounds like you're talking a bit about how David Deutsch has taken Popper's concepts of science and knowledge, and most recently he's begun to talk about theories of knowledge being in the media of information and work coincidentally.
Of what and what?
Now, of information in a media and work in that same media together can become knowledge, in that it is a semi-permanent replicable, similar to a gene, is a unit of knowledge that exhibits itself in phenotypes. But then we go on to a meme, which Dawkins talks about how we move ideas between brains, and it seems to have a very analogous direction. It's the media now that's different, which is in our wetware, I call it. And that evolution of knowledge is somewhat under our control and in almost real time, as opposed to occurring over hundreds of thousands and millions of years. And that becomes then instantiated in a different media altogether that is not in silicon. And I think you're on the threshold of wanting to say consciousness isn't necessarily computable.
Oh, I wouldn't say that. I mean, that's a big can of worms, but I wouldn't agree with you. I don't know that it is, but I see no reason to suspect that it's not. And I don't think it has anything to do with silicon versus carbon. That's the kind of argument that the philosophers of science made about why we couldn't automate discovery. So I do think that I do think there are plenty of kinds of knowledge that are implicit, and that's a weakness. Science is its secret weapon is the formal expression of hypotheses and models, laws and models, and that we can then make them testable. But there's still lots of stuff that goes on in science that we have not codified, and this is one of the reasons why I think replication is so difficult in fields like biology and the social sciences, because we don't have it all written down, and that's hard. But I don't think that's about silicon versus carbon. We can have a beer tonight and argue about it there. Okay.
Okay, thank you so much. We are going to take a 5-minute break, and then we will come
Thanks,
back
guys.
for some AI journeys. So if everybody could be back by 4.